Hello, this is a second mini lecture on the cases that we're covering in the context of our topic of the common law and the environment. Unlike the first case, Madison versus Ducktown, sulfur, copper, and iron, which addressed a private nuisance issue, this one, Missouri versus Illinois, focuses on public nuisance. And unlike Georgia versus Tennessee copper, Missouri versus Illinois addresses water pollution as the main focus, whereas Georgia versus Tennessee copper focuses on an air pollution issue. Now, one thing to briefly note is that the case involves two states and was brought under the U.S. Supreme Court's original jurisdiction. The facts are relatively straightforward. Like many other cities a century ago, water quality and water contamination were huge issues, led to disease outbreaks like cholera. And Chicago, as a large city, was trying to improve the drinking water that was provided to its citizens. Rather than disposing of its wastewater directly into Lake Michigan, which was also the source of its drinking water, it attempted to dispose of it by flushing it into the Des Plaines River, which flowed into the Illinois River and then into the Mississippi River. And the way it ended up doing so was by constructing a canal that carried the wastewater into Des Plaines, Illinois, and then the Mississippi. I have a slide that shows the significant public works aspect of this. This is a several mile long canal that was built. And the outcome here, of course, was to significantly improve the health and also the water quality of what the citizens of Chicago received. As you can imagine, the downstream states and population, including here, of course, the state of Missouri, wasn't happy about that because their perception was now the state of Illinois and Chicago was dumping its waste and essentially letting it be washed down to the cities of St. Louis and others downstream. As a result, this lawsuit occurred. And so just to give you the bottom line here, because I think it's important to keep that in mind as I address a few of the additional details here. The state of Missouri, of course, was unsuccessful. And most of this really illustrates, in part, the proof issues that a doctrine like public nuisance presents to addressing environmental issues. I think from a broader perspective, dumping raw sewage into the river, of course, is one way to deal with it and is advantageous to the entity, the population that wants to get rid of it. But in general, as an environmental matter, of course, that is not what we approve of or think is the preferred way of addressing pollution issues. And public nuisance doctrine here, as it was applied in Missouri versus Illinois, demonstrates that the requirements of showing harm and causation present real impediments. Now, keep in mind here, of course, that Missouri and the city of St. Louis were, of course, significantly downstream, and the proof issues, I think, were real. Ultimately, there was probably no substantive harm and no real causation between what the issues that the city of St. Louis raised and the sewage that was dumped into ultimately the Mississippi River by the city of Chicago. So proof issues are real, but I don't think that the state of Missouri had a substantively successful claim. The Supreme Court here dealt with two primary issues. First, was there in fact real harm, as asserted by the state of Missouri through the number of typhoid fever deaths? And secondly, was there assuming that there was real harm, was there really a causal connection? Meaning, could the sewage that was dumped into the rivers actually have reached the city of St. Louis and then caused the harm, the illnesses, the deaths that the state of Missouri alleged to have been connected to that. On the typhoid fever deaths, the numbers, I think if you look at them carefully, of course, are problematic. The numbers, if you graph them, show that there was a significant spike in deaths way before the opening of the canal, and then only a gradual rise after 1900 that the state of Missouri claimed was directly the result of the dumping of sewage. And so the first question that arises, if you look at the numbers, is whether there really is a real increase given the variations in the past. The court ultimately, if you look at the outcome, seems to suggest that this really did not rise to the requisite amount of proof. And broadly, we would nowadays probably look at this as a statistical proof issue problem here of whether there really is a causal connection between the increased number of deaths and the cause here that was asserted. Note here, by the way, also, of course, that the state of Missouri had other cities dumping raw sewage into the Mississippi River upstream of St. Louis. And I think there was a broader question whether, in fact, how much any illnesses that were found in the city of St. Louis ultimately could have been attributed to the city of Chicago in light of these other contributors of wastewater. The second issue, and the more important one, was really the causation one, and that is, as I mentioned, could the wastewater and the typhoid bacilli dumped upstream actually have caused the illness that far downstream? And remember that the distance between the city of Chicago and St. Louis was 357 miles. It would have taken the bacilli between 8 to 18 and a half days, plus an additional 48 hours from the intake of the water from the river to distribution of the water into households, the population of St. Louis, before there would be an effect. And of course, there were conflicting findings or studies that seemed to suggest, at a minimum, great deal of uncertainty. The broader question is, could really the bacilli have, the bacteria have survived that long in the river water to cause the deaths and the illnesses that were then experienced in the city of St. Louis? Ultimately, and one other thing to note is that the river water, because the canal ended up carrying actually significant amounts of water from Lake Michigan into the Des Plaines, the Illinois, and then the Mississippi River, seems to actually have been improved. The water quality was improved because more lake water was being introduced, and therefore diluting any sort of water contamination. The bottom line, as I said, was that the proof of a causal connection seemed to be quite unclear. The Supreme Court then decided that essentially the state of Missouri had not met its burden of proof and found against it on the public nuisance claim. Right. So, bottom line here, causation and harm issues are requisites in order to make out a public nuisance claim. But at the same time, these are real obstacles then, and very difficult to overcome. And nowadays remain important barriers to successful maintenance of a public nuisance claim. Thank you.